Okay. Welcome everyone to the Brooklyn Rail's 264th New Social Environment. I'm Catherine Olson, Director of Advertising here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation where the March Critics page comes to life. We are joined by Sarah Cowan, Pac Pobric, Kaitlyn A. Kramer, Will Fenstermaker, and the Rail's very own Charles Schultz. We're also very lucky to have storyteller and performance artist Helixx C Armageddon returning to our Zoom stage, who will read to close today's program. We start all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first, that here in Brooklyn, we are on the unceded land and waters of Lenape-Hoking, which still belongs to the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second acknowledgement is that Black Lives Matter. We recognize the legacy of settler colonialism as a part of the many contemporary expressions of white supremacy, and we honor those that have lost their lives to this violence. I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions as we do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo this legacy of injustice. And now to briefly introduce today's guests. Sarah Cowan is a writer as well as producer and editor in digital content at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Pac Pobric is a writer and managing editor at ArtNet News. Kaitlyn A. Kramer is a writer based in Brooklyn, also works at the Calder Foundation. Will Fenstermaker is an art critic based in New York and an editor and producer at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Christopher Alessandrini is a writer based in Brooklyn. And now passing the mic to the Rail's managing editor, Charles Schultz.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm feeling very honored to be in the company of Will, our guest critic, and some of the wonderful contributors. I have to say that there were a number of mentions of manifestos in this issue, more so than usual. I took a moment to note them. In our book section, we led off with a review of Legacy Russell's book, Glitch Feminism, which Olivier Begruen reviewed. In our feature section, the artist Shabalala Self described making one of her audio works as a manifesto. In our art review section, Justine Kurland's show Scum Manifesto showed up. In our field notes section, the filmmaker Philip Risk talked about Rethinking the Apocalypse, an indigenous anti-futurist manifesto. So whatever is happening in the universe right now, there is a trend towards manifesto thinking being published in the Rail, and none more thoughtfully than those that I'm in the company with today. Will, you were well ahead of this moment, if we can call it a zeitgeist, having pitched and been commissioned to do this well before March. Can you kind of frame us here, frame the topic for us about what bit of manifestos made you want to get into this critics page, made you want to dig in here?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to hear you kind of start by listing the number of mentions, because part of it was a sense that there really weren't that many recently, and that like the last I'd heard of an art manifesto and a manifesto written by an artist was years ago in undergrad, and wasn't really treated with any kind of serious rigor. I think I mentioned in my piece the most recent manifesto I'd read was written by a gunman, actually. So it felt like this form had kind of molded in a way very particular to our culture, and I wanted to go back and try to see what exactly is the impulse that leads someone to write something like that leads, what is that kind of sense of idealism and naivete that leads someone to kind of want to propose that vision out into the world. And then to ask everybody to help account for what changed. I mean, what in the culture has changed that created this unique role for manifestos, where they don't always succeed in the way, they very rarely succeed in the way that they set out to do. So, it's really important to do that with a group, I think. It's a project I've been interested in a long time, and have some plans and continuing on my own. But in order to get it started, it felt really important to kind of assemble a group of people to help embody that kind of communal critical spirit that manifestos represent. So yeah, then it was just a matter of kind of trying to find people who saw something in that as well, because it really is a form that I don't think gets a lot of attention, and a number of people who I approached really felt like why do you want to do a section on manifestos in particular? What's interesting about them? In fact, Noah, who isn't with us today, wrote a piece about that, kind of arguing that they don't have a lot of value. We should be skeptical of them. We shouldn't really listen to what they're saying because what they're saying doesn't hold up. So that was a really helpful piece to have in the section too. So if folks haven't read that, I'd encourage them to. And if Noah shows up at any point today, maybe we can ask him about it.
I hope he does. For those of us who are here, one incredible thing happened. You wrote about manifestos during a time when our government experienced an insurrection. We all watched it on television and through our various devices. I would love to hear kind of the feelings, the effect that moment had as you were thinking about the various manifestos that you had undertaken. And Pac, I'm kind of hoping you'll lead us off here because your piece kind of took this question head on in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I didn't feel it really made sense to talk about art at the time that I was writing about this manifesto. So I just selected this speech given by Robespierre to the National Assembly in France in 1782, I believe, arguing that any trial for King Louis XVI would basically hold forth the possibility that he was not guilty. It didn't make sense to write about art at the time. I was pretty stressed out. I didn't really want to look at pretty pictures or anything. So I selected that for that reason. I just was not able to think about anything other than politics at that exact moment.
What's like, Pac, what's interesting about, your piece, one, because it was kind of the most explicit reaction to that. I think you were the only writer who ended up totally pulling away from what could really be considered an art manifesto and talking about this other text within the context of actually, no, I take that back. You didn't really bring that to art at all. It was really a political piece. But there really was a sense among the section as a whole that it really felt besides the point. A number of people wrote to me to say, with all of this trauma kind of being inflicted in the larger culture, why are we talking about something as kind of solipsistic as manifestos, so insular as manifestos? And I'd always write back to say that, that's what manifestos have always been about. They've always been about trauma and healing. And because of that, the section is a little messy in some ways, but I actually like that rawness to it. Because, in reality, very few manifestos truly are solipsistic. They're for the most part, they're always about how art interfaces with the world at large. And as I say in my piece, they tend to increase in frequency throughout really turbulent moments in history. World War II in the 1960s in particular, there are a lot of manifestos that we still read today. And one thing that I've kind of since learned, and that Charlie, you've reminded us, is that a lot of manifestos are being written today. I mentioned the Book of Sleep in my piece, and we were supposed to have a text on Legacy Russell's glitch feminism, and that fell through. So it's great to see that it still appeared in the paper. Yes, there were other people who kind of expressed some hesitation about that, and it appears in other pieces as well. Like, Sarah in particular, she manages to bring a manifesto from the 60s and talk about, what's relevant to today and what, what the writer of that manifesto importantly kind of failed to predict about our moment. So when we look back at it now, it we're able to see it in a very different light. So I'm curious if maybe Sarah would like to chime in and talk a little bit.
I mean, I don't think that my piece which is about the Maintenance Art Manifesto by Meryl Laderman Euclides. I don't think that piece directly spoke to the insurrection itself, but I was really thinking about it when, I'm not sure if any of you saw the photos of the aftermath, when the Black workers are cleaning up the mess. And it made me think of the line in the manifesto where she says, I'm going to read it so I get it right, but it says, "The sour ball of every revolution, after the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning?" And I think that, I could talk about this later, but I really saw more the essential worker and care for appreciation of the essential worker as the parallel to Euclides's manifesto, and this idea of those who maybe are not visible and who aren't the focus of major action or development, as she puts it, who actually are maintaining these spaces and even maintaining the structures that actually exploit them or don't take their well-being into account. So to me, I was just thinking maybe I was on the maintenance art mind, and I think we all felt really chaotic that week. So I don't think that the piece really relates to the siege, but it was interesting for me to see, comparing like I think the photograph of the noose outside on the Capitol lawn was the worst image I saw of the entire day. And to see that and then to see Black folks cleaning up the mess was really disturbing.
I think that's a very salient point, Sarah. And it makes me think of actually a line that I singled out in Pac's piece because it talks about habit, and habit is one of the things our publisher reminds us is the most difficult thing for any person to change. I'm going to read this line I singled out in Pac's piece because I think it connects very much with what you're just saying. Pac writes, "Habit. Such is the natural domain of habit that we regard the most arbitrary conventions, sometimes indeed the most defective institutions, as absolute measures of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice." And when I think about the habits that are part and parcel of government operations and how those habits were so ruthlessly and violently upset, and how quickly those habits were brought back. I'm curious, Pac, to hear you make a comparison between the Biden administration's coming to power and how they handled the return to habits, for lack of a better word, and the moment in the French Revolution that you kind of singled in on. Yeah.
Well, I think there's always a desire in moments of upheaval on the part of at least a certain group of people, sometimes a large group of people, to reinstall what's lost, to recapture former glories, to settle things down, to not go further. And, that's the entire promise of the Biden administration. We'll calm things down. We'll, tone down the rhetoric. We'll reestablish relations with the rest of the world as they existed, under all the other neoliberal Clintonite presidents that we've had, Obama, Clinton. So it's really, it's very much there's a desire to reinstall the old order, and that's what's happening right now. It looks slightly more radical to people, I believe, because the thing that we're comparing it to, the immediate predecessor, was so abysmal, but it really is a very sort of basic reinstallation of the old order. There's not a tremendous amount that we're seeing that's too different from the Obama presidency or the Clinton presidency, really. I mean, Biden speaks in their language. He lives in their world. He wants to reinstate their legacies. And that's what the moderates wanted to do to some degree in the French Revolution. There were certain aristocratic moderates who wanted to put the king on trial, convict him, and then have the order that was reinstalled be a sort of democratic order, but that had taken seriously his existence and that didn't simply wipe him from the slate. And that's what Robespierre was very much against. He didn't like the idea that basically that the possibility that the king was somehow right in what he'd done, without getting into too many specifics. But one thing actually that really struck me about all the pieces, especially with the group that's here, is there's this real concern, and they're really, the articles really strike me as Trump era stories, even though they were published right after Trump, but they're really written in this Trump era moment. But there's a real concern, I think, that each of us had with backsliding, with regression. Christopher talks about how this, brilliant architectural project basically just becomes like, upper middle class housing and a model for, the wealthy to recreate. Sarah talks about how maintenance basically catches up with art and sort of subsumes it, right? Everyone's just kind of like keeping things going. I was struck by that. That stuck out for me. And Kaitlyn too, in fact, the moment where she talks about, here's what happened in Seattle in 1999, and then there are some resonances with what's going on today, but it's funny, there's this like long period in between where it's possible that maybe not as much happens. That's up for debate. I suppose somebody could challenge me on that. But anyway, I just wanted to note that.
I mean, I think to kind of go back to what you're saying in the beginning, Charlie, and to try and start bringing, like Kaitlyn into the conversation, I think in the simplest sense, looking at manifestos is a way of looking at art history as a kind of ongoing dialogue rather than as a series of causes and effects, right? It's a bit more mutable and not quite so dogmatic about why things are the way that they are. And I know that sounds contradictory because manifestos can be really dogmatic. In fact, that's kind of the impression that we have of them, that they're these really bold dogmatic claims about why things should be a certain way. But if we look at them as arguments responding to each other and to the world, and not as closed off, rarefied texts in art history textbooks, that perspective can change. And I think you can look at someone like Alan Sekula, as Kaitlyn did. She wrote about his photographs of protests in the 90s, and see pretty clearly that he in some way anticipated a very important moment in Seattle that had really clear ripple effects around the globe. But right around the time that he was photographing images of individual faces within mass protests, Seattle's kind of two economic overlords, Microsoft, and then shortly after Amazon, they became really interested in facial recognition technology. And last summer, we saw that same technology being used to identify protesters within crowds who are now covering their faces, right? So Kaitlyn has this thing about the goggles being used to, as a defense against tear gas. And since those kind of face coverings have evolved into a different kind of debate, a different kind of defense. So I want to be honest about like what we're talking about, because really manifestos are just rhetorical arguments. I don't want to be like too mystical about them, and I don't want to suggest that Sekula in some way, summoned the surveillance state through magical images. But they are, they're part of a history of interrelated phenomena, right? You can look at manifestos, you can look at them as expressions of a future, and you can ask yourself to what degree that future came true, which parts changed, which parts were left out, which ones were destroyed through some kind of conflict. And I think that's, that's a really illuminating thing to do, because it's a way of asking, why the world is the way that it is, and also whether it can be any different.
I will say too that Sakula's project with waiting for tear gas in many ways actually contradicts a larger argument he has about portraiture. Maybe many people have read a somewhat seminal essay of his, I believe it's called The Body in the Archive, but he likens portraiture to the images that police keep in files of, like, I think it's the 40 points of recognition in a face that can convict them or identify them for conviction. So it is interesting in this way for him to go into a protest and look at the faces of protest and see them as sort of this like future emanation of like what protests will look like in years to come through the protesters' gaze and less their actual like portrait. So I don't know, that was something that I couldn't really get into in this forum, but something that I found to be kind of interesting, especially with, you know, this was a protest in Seattle, and that kind of was, I think, probably one of the first like cyberspace assembled protests. And Sakula very explicitly was like, this is not, like, my images are not meant to be contending with the internet, you know, obviously being really like critical of Bill Gates at the time as well. And he intentionally took these analog photos and presented them in a very analog way. So you almost have to seek them out to kind of go into the more mystical realm, experience of what it is to be like sitting in wait with that kind of experience of being at a protest, which actually in this last year, I'm sure many of us experienced. So.
Yeah, I want to add on to that, Kaitlyn. I'm not sure everybody's aware that the Sakula chose to display those on a slide projector. So there was a specific amount of time each image was available to an audience member, and then the audience member, you know, had to wait. And I think the the presence of being in front of a projector that has this sense of time and movement built into the experience of it was another just a very savvy choice by Alan to kind of reinstill some of the foundational ideas in the piece into how the viewer would experience what he was working on. Would you agree with that, Kaitlyn?
I would. I also thought, I think the scholar Terry Weissman brings this argument to the fore in her discussion of Sakula, but she looks at Roland Barthes in his, one of the points he works through in Camera Lucida, the photograph as being that which was, and she talks about how Sakula really like flips that on its head and is like by showing images of people waiting for an event that you as a viewer are waiting to discern, you're engaging in this loop that becomes continuous and thus sort of propels you towards a future event. And so they become kind of timeless in their simplicity because they just, they predict something that's completely indiscernible. So, and I think time really does factor into that. I mean, so the interval is actually, it's 11 seconds, which is actually an extraordinary amount of time. There are a lot of images in the installation. So, you know, to actually sit with that, it does take time, and, you know, not to spoil the experience, but it's to no end. You're just waiting in a loop of waiting, and you only get out of it when you choose to. So.
Yeah, and that choice is like the viewer has to choose to walk away and leave, and that in and of itself is another. It's a powerful situation that Sakula sets up with that. I mean, I just have no end of gratitude and respect for those decisions. And while we're talking about things cycling and shifting, and I kind of wanted to move over and hear Chris talk a little bit about. Chris drew a line with utopia and ideas of utopia, and how ideas of utopia. Well, Chris, could you kind of share with us?
Yeah, of course. So I wrote about this community in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is my hometown, called Six Moon Hill. And it was designed by these couples who had been founding members of the Architects Collaborative alongside Walter Gropius. And they built these sort of modern homes in the New England landscape, these sort of little enclaves where they could like go live and design and have the lives that they really wanted to have that they weren't able to have in the city. And so they created these sort of utopias that ended up becoming like fairly copied across the region, and then they ended up kind of becoming a national trend. But the whole idea was that, you know, they would be made with, you know, very, very affordable materials. Everyone would have a sort of similar amount of land. The floor plans were made so that communal spaces were really prioritized and private spaces were sort of shrunk. It was a really interesting idea that came out of the Bauhaus Proclamation, you know, decades before in 1919. And what ended up happening is that they kind of exuded this glamour that people found so appealing that Vogue ended up profiling their community. You know, beautiful young academics, you know, having it all. They have the family life, they have beautiful suburban homes. And then like, you know, and then the market followed pretty quickly. And soon you had furniture manufacturers that were, you know, importing designs from Denmark, and it just kind of became, you know, the day's most glamorous style. And I don't know, while I didn't really respond to the insurrection necessarily with my piece, I was sort of responding more to the sort of long moment that we've all been stuck in with coronavirus and being stuck indoors. And I've just been very interested in the way that a lot of focus has shifted to interiors and how obsessive people have become, both with, you know, paying attention to their own environments, but also paying attention to others and what the objects in their homes might, you know, signal about them. Because that's sort of, you know, at the root of this movement was just sort of your home is designed to fit you. It's also, you know, anyone can design their home to fit themselves. Yeah.
I mean, I think like, you know, Chris, you and Kaitlyn, I think, are onto something really similar, just about the kind of how to describe this. You know, I don't necessarily think that we, you know, should read manifestos because of their, you know, ability to predict the future, right? I mean, they don't. It's really the opposite. Their visions are almost always kind of corrupted and perverted. And both you and Kaitlyn, I think, do a really interesting job of articulating the way that it kind of like goes both ways. It's this, you know, this dialogue of texts. It both, you know, looks towards the future, but the future is itself kind of responding to this vision and tracing the ways that it kind of gets morphed and molded. Says a lot about how we've ended up where we are. I mean, one thing that you and I talked about in your edit, and I know this, you know, this was much too complicated to make it into your piece, but we talked about the idea that like at the same time that this was happening in New England, the Bauhaus ideology had kind of gone through the Ulm School of Design in Germany after World War II, where it had adapted to this very kind of American idea of consumerism. So you had the ideology kind of bifurcated, and eventually through people like Dieter Rams, that Ulm School theory of the Bauhaus gets picked up into things like Apple and IKEA. So again, it kind of like circles around back to what you were just saying about interiority, right? And so there's the sense that like if you really want to know, you know, if you really want to understand what exactly the role that these things have in our lives, something like an iPhone or even the furniture, you have to look at the entire way that the dreams of the Bauhaus have been you know, morphed and molded over time. So, you know, looking at them this way, it's really, really useful in trying to figure out how we got to where we are. And I think like, you know, understanding them as more than just like little points in time, more than as just like a didactic declaration, and kind of looking at the exchange of ideas that happens around them, it can be, you know, really helpful and really illuminating, and changes the way that we think about a lot of works of art. I'm not really sure, you know, if if you have a thought in relation to that, or if someone else wants to jump in, or if Charlie wants to redirect us. But I'm just noticing a thread between you and Kaitlyn.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was definitely thinking about, especially after I read your piece, Will, talking about, a lot of people writing back to you saying that these are sort of academic exercises. One thing I realized, Six Moon Hill and all the communities that sort of formed, they were just like very, very real manifestations of it. I mean, the Bauhaus itself was both like, a school and, an idea, and, it moved around a bit. I mean, it was relatively short-lived. I think it was like 1919 to 1933. But the ideas just continue to go on, and they change, and they really are. If you have an iPhone and you pick it up, and you're like, if the design is really fading into the background, and you sort of allowed that to become part of yourself, like, I mean, that is part of the Bauhaus ideology that's like living on. And I really do think like design really is kind of like it carries the ideas of the people who came up with it into the future. And so I've been very interested right now in this moment, the obsession with sort of like, maybe this is just my Instagram feed, but like mid-century modern furniture just seems like it's everywhere right now. And I'm interested in kind of like, what it means when, a sort of new generation comes in contact with these older ideas and latches onto them, and what that brings forward. Sorry, there is a honking debacle outside, but yeah, that idea of the future and then things continuing to live on in unexpected ways was very much on my mind.
Right, so like Kaitlyn said, the photo, Bart's idea of like the photograph, that has been Sakula's is I guess the that will be. It's both at the same time, and it's a difficult thing to trace, but it leads to new openings. It leads to new ideas. So this is kind of in my piece I say something about how like even the most didactic and solipsistic manifestos like Rothko's and Gottlieb, and I'm forgetting the third author who basically wrote a defense of abstract expressionism in the New York Times in the 40s, how even that ends up being incredibly generous because of that mutability, even though they're advocating for a kind of cloistering because of the way that idea can be picked up and changed and molded and I mean, just inspiring, right? And that's the word. It ends up in a very kind of broad and expansive and opening role within the way that cultural production actually is shaped.
On the other side of that, I would point out that Helixx remains artist in residence. So that's not something I would have expected to have endured so long. Sarah, do you maybe want to share something about the durational quality of what Helixx, of how her work and that idea has really has maybe endured more than most of the manifestos that we've addressed in this moment?
Sure. I mean, I think what's impressive about Helixx, which is that her work after that manifesto it changes. Like she was making kind of sculptural, wall pieces, like pieces that you would put on the wall, and kind of like paintings that were three-dimensional. And it was, feminist in nature, I would say, but she was having so much pushback from male teachers, and she had children and was suffering really under those circumstances, like to make work. So her manifesto, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with it, but her manifesto is really saying, now my work as a mother is going to be the basis for my art. It's like she was kind of recasting her maintenance tasks as art. And what's interesting is that she doesn't necessarily align herself with, feminism in that sense. In a way she moves away from that, and she thinks more about like civic structures that relate to that. And so it's very interesting to me that like she thinks about, she has an interesting piece about, cleaning the art in a museum, and how once I forget now what it is. It's basically like she stamps a case or something, and because it's a maintenance artwork, because of her stamp, then no longer can the worker, the technician who cleans the glass, he can't clean it anymore because now it's a work of art, so only conservators can clean it. And so she shows how like there's different levels of, you know, what's the word, like basically expertise at how to take care of something, and how that gets delineated. And what's interesting is that then she starts to work with the sanitation workers in New York at the time when New York is having a huge crisis with sanitation, and the workers are actually planning to go on strike. And there's a, you know, basically the city is in bankruptcy at that point, and she decides to make a piece where she becomes the artist in residence. She proposes this to the Department of Sanitation. I think I have to remember the actual story, but it's like there's a bad review basically of her art that I think leads her to want to do this, because they're like, she might as well just be like an artist in the Department of Sanitation. And then she's like, that's an awesome idea. And then she proposes it. And it's interesting because there are residencies now in these, you know, civic departments, and this is basically the first one that, and it still is her position, and it's not paid, which I find interesting actually, because I think that when I think about Euclides's work, it has less to do with like the wages for housework campaign. It's like less about finding pay for unpaid labor, which I can get into later. But I think the idea between like what is art and what is like caring for your family, like both those spaces tend to not be valued in terms of wage labor. But I think that, where am I going with this? My point is that then she ends up doing a piece where she shakes hands with every sanitation worker. I think it's something like 7,000. I should look up the number, but and she takes a photo with each worker and she talks to them for a while. And so this is her piece called Touch Sanitation. And in my piece for the Rail, I was connecting that to the 7 p.m. clap, because there was a sense in which like Ed Koch was like a big fan of this work of art, even though he was fighting with the unions, because it, you know, it showed appreciation for the workers, and it kind of ends up almost making her look like a politician, like in her, you know, when a politician like rolls up their sleeves and like goes down and talks to the workers. So I'm sorry, there's an environmental protection truck that's part of the conversation. But
that's actually really interesting.
I know. So, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. But basically, it's interesting how she ends up positioning this work, which maybe started from a feminist point of view, into a realm that has more to do with aligning mothers' labor or women's labor with sanitation workers, with custodial workers, with technicians in museums. So I was really interested in that at a time when the museum I work in was very limited to the staff who was cleaning and guarding the museum, and when we were seeing a lot of appreciation for the healthcare workers, but I think I had some interesting conversations about how that 7 p.m. clap could have been extended to custodial workers or those who are cleaning the spaces for us to stay healthy. And so I don't know if that answered your question.
I mean, I think like what's also interesting about specifically her manifesto for me is that, I mean, she kind of declines to actually make a civic statement. I mean, the manifesto is an exhibition proposal. It's she's outlining a work of art that she would like to, and I don't know, Sarah, maybe you know whether or not she actually did organize this exhibition or something. I don't know, but she ends up in this role as a civic artist in residence at a civic program, and yet her manifesto is actually kind of, how do I say it? It doesn't entirely open out into the world, right? It really is kind of focused on a very specific thing, which is an exhibition. And I think, what's interesting to me about your piece, Sarah, is that you and again, I don't want to be too mystical about this, like suggesting a causality that isn't actually there, but you kind of highlight how that limitation carries on today and how we're looking at maintenance workers, and how this 7 p.m. clap is a kind of performativism that's not accompanied by you know, hazard pay or anything like that. That's not what that is. It's a clap, it's a recognition. Yes, that has like symbolic content, symbolic meaning, but it isn't the kind of broad recognition of maintenance that she was actually calling for. It's a kind of symbolic recognition of that maintenance. And you conclude by saying, you know, the idea was right, care, but we need to consider it as a political proposal, not as an exhibition proposal. So I like that you kind of opened it up and showed how this, you know, limitation of her work is in some way parallel to the limitation of what we're living through today, as this moment has kind of overtaken her.
You know, Will, it's interesting you say that, because there's a line in your piece that I wanted to ask the panelists about, and it's italicized, so you really make a point of stressing it, but you say symbolic change is real change. And I thought, I'm not, maybe, you know, I sort of did a bit of a double take. I wasn't sure, because if Ed Koch can say, this is great, look, we got this, you know, lady out here shaking everyone's hand, like, I'm all for the sanitation workers. And then if we're, you know, standing on our balconies banging, you know, with pots and pans for 3-4 minutes after dinner, I wondered what people thought about that line, because it struck me, and I don't know that it's necessarily untrue. I just think that it has to be qualified. I think it can be real change. I think symbolic change can be real change, but I don't know if symbolic change is real change.
I'll let others respond to that before I try to defend that line.
Well, just to relate it, what you were saying about Euclid's manifesto, and what I should say is that basically the impressive thing about Euclid is that her work after the manifesto is so tightly tied to the manifesto. Like, for decades, she's been doing work that iterates on the ideas in the manifesto. And I think it's interesting because she does kind of extend beyond the art context. She keeps like bringing more things into the art context. So she ends up doing these like work ballets where she like has all these people with their like forklifts like doing these ballets and stuff, and it's all very symbolic, and it's all very you know, it's more about showing the beauty of work, and so to Pac's point, I think that what's interesting is, at least within the realm of the manifesto and her exhibition proposal, which she doesn't really do that exhibition, she is trying to, I was thinking about another thing that Will put in his piece about manifestare, which is like to make public. And so she makes motherhood and its behaviors and tasks like public, but only in the realm of like a museum, which I think is different and is more symbolic than actually making it public. Do you know what I mean? And I feel like there's a line that's really like tenuous in her work, and that I was thinking about with the manifestos, and I was thinking about with Pac's question and also his piece about, you know, the public, like the civic, or, you know, the less symbolic changes versus like an art manifesto, and how far that can really go in truly making something public, and truly making change.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, who is the public? Like, that's, I think, in terms of Pac's question for, like, the kind of search for qualifications to make Will's statement true. I mean, you know, just to even speak to Sakula, like, you know, he's making these images that are at once very urgent, but then they're exhibited in museums. You know, like, what's that public? Like, who is being invited to enact the kind of contemplation that the work is begging. And I think Euclid as well, as you just said, like, it's she's making public this kind of labor that is almost to like a public that is maybe acknowledging it more quietly. You know, it's like they were already kind of on their way towards like that kind of symbolic understanding. So Yeah, I think you and I, Sarah, specifically wrote about manifestos that really are, and you read about this actually in your essay, how there's like a manifesto that is an artwork and then a manifesto that is not. And I think our manifestos that we worked with, they are contending with artwork at minimum. So I guess there's a line there.
Yeah, Pac, I think your question is a good one, but the example you gave is a little loaded, because Ed Koch, shaking the hands of sanitation workers is not actually really symbolic change. Ukele's shaking the hands of sanitation workers is symbolic change, and that's the point that Kaitlyn's making, right? It changes the public, it changes who that image reaches, and therefore changes the way that our society kind of orients itself around that idea through that image, right? So yeah, that's my response. But I would actually be really curious to know if other people had problems with that line, or felt that I was being a little too forgiving of frivolous artistic activity at times. But.
Well, I think that Amelia, who's not here, who wrote about a manifesto, I forget the artist's name, I'm sorry, the woman who she planted
Agnes Dennis.
Agnes Dennis, right? She planted wheat in Manhattan in Battery Park, I think, and she talks about how it just, like the gesture doesn't go far enough, where it's too aesthetic or it's too limited, and I know I think it's fair to speak for Amelia on this. We've had some conversations, but she's very skeptical of the manifesto genre, and she wrote through that skepticism in her essay. And yeah, I would encourage people to read that for maybe a counterpoint that isn't necessarily, it's a counterpoint to Will's.
Yeah, and Noah as well. Noah and Amelia were the two kind of skeptics of the group. And I think, like, going back to this idea of mutability, I mean, Amelia less so. I mean, she had very particular concerns about one project and what its limitations were. And I think actually a very similar way as Sarah's describing Ukele's project. But Noah's skepticism was a little bit more about that mutability and basically feeling as if these manifestos that he raised, which were much more kind of expressions of like frivolous, esoteric art speak, are essentially meaningless. And so the way that they get molded and modeled and adapted makes analyzing them basically kind of a fool's errand, and you might as well just not look at them at all and look at the artwork. And I think that's a valid point. I would argue that more manifestos tend to come out of what Sarah and Kaitlyn are talking about, this kind of this expression of solidarity or care or grief in a way. They what am I trying to say? I mean, they're an expression of idealism at a time where it's very kind of being idealistic we're jaded towards it, right? That's kind of treated as suspicious, in part because of this kind of seeing where all of the ideals of the 20th century led us, and all the various kind of horrors that came out of it. But I think I mean that's a trap civically, but it's also a dead end artistically. So I think if we stop, I'm losing my train of thought, but if we stop looking at that, if we stop writing manifestos, if we stop looking at that expression of the future, which is incredibly important to express to express the future, but we'd also damage our ability to figure out how it is that we've arrived at the present. I mean, that's important politically, but it's also important artistically, because essentially what you're talking about is losing the ability to dream, right? I'm feeling as if I'm rambling, so I'm going to pull back and maybe let someone come in and have an opportunity to say something else. But I think Christopher is kind of also hovering around this idea with his piece.
Yeah, no, that capacity to dream is exactly kind of what's, sort of like, how do you look back at a moment where, someone feels they care so much, or they're so fed up with a certain way of being and existing that they decide to sit down and actually like write out a sort of, manifest, almost in the sort of, like the maritime sense of the word, like a list of things that they're carrying, or they're hoping to carry into the future, or they wish to change and see radically redrawn. How do you preserve that space? I know you end your piece, not to spoil it for everyone here, with the word naive. I mean, it is an extremely naive thing you have to do. You have to understand that it probably will get pummeled and distorted, and all of these horrible things will probably happen to this early set of dreams and demands that you or your group are putting forward, and yet you have to decide that it is worth doing it anyway, and that the outcome, even if it's very far from what you wanted, will at least be interesting. I see in the comments, yes, a packing list for the sojourn by G.E. Schwartz. I like that a lot. That's exactly what I'm saying. You just make your packing list anyway. And then if it gets taken up, I mean, you also never know like where these things are going to lead. That's kind of one of the things that I've been really interested in about it. It might not lead to, your ideal in any kind of way, but I don't think any of the original architects in the Architects Collaborative were hoping that their homes would now sell for $1.5 or $2 million. That's like very far from their original ideas, which was the sort of socialist utopia. But are we still glad that those houses exist in some form or another? Like I am, at least, even if they're now sort of out of reach for most people to live in.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. I'm aware that one of our panelists is going to depart shortly, so I want to take advantage of his last few moments. There was a sense that surprised me, thread in the line of these manifestos. The word care and the notion care appeared in a multitude of contexts, and almost never in the same way. Pac quotes Robespierre as telling the citizens to have a care. Sarah very adeptly points out to think of the exhibition proposal of Helixx as a political proposal for care. And in Kaitlyn's piece, when Kaitlyn discusses the grief and empathy that the teargrass, what's the word I want to say? Like physically, but not emotionally withdraws from the participants. That too is a form of care when one connects the etymology of the word back to its origins, which is in trauma and grief. So before Pac departs and before we shift to another section, I'm hoping we can just kind of bounce around and say a word about how care exists in the manifesto that was discussed. Pac, you mind leading us off?
No, I can. I mean, I think Will does such a good job in his introduction of outlining what it is that all these various things do, even though they come from different times and places, the manifesto that we all picked and that all the other writers in the section picked. And I think the bottom line is that you really do have to care enough to have a wild dream to write one of these things down. Now, to Christopher's point about following it through and seeing where it takes you, not knowing where it goes, there is a situation in which some of these manifestos can become nightmares. You could make the case, and I think it's not a terrible argument, that the Communist Manifesto leads into the nightmare of Stalinism, for example, which is a much, much worse nightmare, obviously, than a house selling for $1 million. So they're so different from one another that it's not even worth comparing them. So I don't think what I'm suggesting cuts against what Chris is saying. But you do have to care enough, I suppose, to write one of these things and then follow it through. And sometimes they can really lead to a sort of, I think that's the worst case scenario, but that's a possibility of a certain kind.
I think that's really interesting because that's basically what I ended up trying to say about maintenance, is that it felt like that's the nightmare we've ended up being in. Like, her manifesto set us up, like we would never have actually thought, and I don't think she would have actually thought, that maintenance would become the dominant theme rather than development, or we're like, we've been in this year where we're like, at the beginning I was like washing my clothes in my sink, and like every task became harder and more overt, and it was just these daily chores that became our whole world. And I think maintaining rather than developing, like, in the sense that, there weren't new, in the art world, there weren't new shows. In the economic world, like, many people were losing their jobs and just trying to survive. And I think, the idea that care comes from suffering or from some kind of grief, like, we've been living in that for an extended period of time, and it's not actually necessarily a good thing, which I think that that's one aspect that's interesting about Euclid's, is that she's a little satirical, I think, about her positioning of maintenance. Like, she says that it's a drag, it's super boring, it's like the stuff that she hates having to do, and she's like changing her kids' diapers. She's not saying like, I love doing this is supposed to be so beautiful, like, why can't this be art? She's saying like, you have to look at this because this is what I have to do with my time, and it means I can't be a dreamy like artist all the time. And so I think that the nightmare is the reality for her, and so it's like the nightmare became real for us this year, as she basically she tried to highlight it in a way so that we would see it, so that maybe something would happen that I don't think she has like a plan for. She's not saying like, I want us to live in the realm of maintenance. She just wants it to be obvious to people that this is a huge part of people's lives. And what I'll say is that, like, I think that we think of, for example, the art world as having all these people who've made a choice for, to live in ideas and to like make new shows and to make art, and that there's a lot of art workers who are those maintenance workers, who are actually the ones who had to do the hard work this year and also were laid off. So I think that to me, it was like really us pulling the veil off of what the art world entails, and who keeps it going.
Thanks, Sarah. Kaitlyn, do you want to share any thoughts on how care or grief relate in your manifesto?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I think specifically about that, I mean, the empathy and grief that you quoted, and also like more directly about care, I think to Sakula capturing these images of such intense police violence, and how, I mean, the battle in Seattle basically set a standard for police intervention in protests as being very militarized. And I think, kind of to think about it in a contemporary way, to think of last summer's protests and the way that, we have been kind of enacting at best a global or at least national sense of care with one another by staying indoors, keeping distance, etc. And then that notion of care translated to actually showing up physically and being in numbers in a space together, kind of becoming these images that mirror Sakula's. So I don't know, that was kind of a maybe not a cohesive thought, but I think just care in the sense of the way that we gather, the way that like the images we make when we do, whether we're consenting to them or not. I don't know. That's what I thought about.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, you know, one of the obvious questions that we had to kind of like contend with at the beginning is just like, can you call what Sakulo is doing a manifesto? Can you call like this collection of images a manifesto? But I think, you know, the etymology that you trace, Charlie, is kind of what makes the case of care as a suffering of mind or of grief. You know, and I always try to remind myself that the root of the word criticism is the same as the root of the word crisis, an ancient Greek word meaning to separate or decide. And one half of that separation and loss is distress or grief, and the other is judgment and decision, which is more of where you know, criticism comes in. But manifestos are that form where those two aspects come back together, right? I mean, it refuses them or attempts to make it whole again. So it is kind of fundamentally a healing thing. I mean, literally that's what these writers are trying to do. They see a void, or they see an absence or an opportunity, and they're trying to make us aware of that and to patch it up. And so, you know, in my piece, I defined that as, you know, an attempt to point the reality of what is towards the dream of what could be. And it's interesting to hear Sarah talking about nightmares in that context, because obviously that's a messy process because we're all individuals and functions of history. But I mean, I believe in the like the fundamental nobility of that aim.
May there be boldness and naivete and more manifestos. Thank you all so much for this very thoughtful round of discussion. I'm going to hand it over to Catherine, who has been collecting questions from our audience. And I'm going to open this conversation up before we have an excellent poetry reading. Catherine, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Our first question is from Olivia Begruin, who was actually our guest critic last summer. Olivia, I can pass the mic to you now. Should be able to unmute.
Hi, thank you very much for this. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. I have a long and rambling question, so I apologize in advance, and it may not be entirely relevant, so I'll try to be as brief as possible, but it relates to some of the things that Will alluded to, and also about the idea of utopia and in more general sense, the history of ideas. And in this recent issue, I wrote a brief review of Legacy Russell's manifesto, Glitch Feminism. And she talks about utopia, also in the footsteps of Fred Moten, who I'm sure is known to most of you, and about the necessity of utopia in the times in which we live. So I really want to be the devil's advocate here and refer to a philosopher who's been very influential for me, at least, and many others, the English philosopher and historian of ideas, John Gray. And I happen to know John Gray personally, and I discussed these issues in the past. And in particular, I refer to a book, very influential book he wrote a while ago called Black Mass, Apocalyptic Religion and the Death of Utopia. So if we agree, and this is you know, a contentious point, that utopia and manifestos are related, and they are in some ways at least, John Gray very much speaks against manifestos, and even more forcefully against historical forms of utopia from the days of the Communist Manifesto all the way to the Surrealist Manifesto beyond, mostly in the political sphere, but also in the artistic sphere. This has to do, for John Gray, with the fact, and I will try to be very, very brief, I promise, that what a manifesto entails historically has to do with a re-evaluation of values, a little bit in the sense that Nietzsche also called for re-evaluation of values, by which we mean a complete blank state as to how we should behave in society. And John Gray makes the point that such a blank state is never a possibility, or if it is a possibility, it is the possibility of fascism. In that way, he relates it to the ideas of Isaiah Berlin and others, that we have to accept our human condition, our imperfect human condition. And manifestos entail this idea of completely reinventing ourselves in such a way that it leads to something that is humanly impossible. And utopia has in itself the possibility of something, an expression of idealism that is not realistic. And this kind of reinvention of the human can only lead to the great catastrophes that we saw, that we witnessed in the 20th century. So my question is simply, can we find a way, a balance between, let's say, on the one hand, the potential of manifestos that are polemical by themselves, and we know that, and then acknowledging the fact that we cannot completely reinvent ourselves in such ways as to deny our humanity?
Yeah, a lot to think about there. I think, certainly that's true of a number of manifestos, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, where the break that they're proposing is quite radical. I don't know if that's true of all manifestos, especially after the war, where you start to see much more skepticism of that kind of radical break. I don't know if Helixx, for example, is proposing that we, stop caring about art altogether in favor of maintenance. In fact, she's kind of creating new terms to help make space for both in a way. So, I'd have to think about this a lot more, but I think I would probably disagree with the kind of inextricable link between manifesto and utopia. I think that's certainly one thing they can do. They can express a utopia, but they can also, they can just shape things around the edges too. I mean, they can open up new little pockets. They can, redirect us a couple degrees or the other. And I think also, particularly if you again look at them less as individuated texts and more as part of a larger dialogue, you can start to see that really they don't and haven't ever, not even the Communist Manifesto has had that drastic of historical rupture to the degree that the spheres. But I'm not entirely sure I've answered your question. It's a big question and an interesting one.
I know it is, and it ought to be refined. And I did not qualify some of the statements that, of course, someone like John Gray makes in a certain depth. And there's also the potential of misreading a manifesto, because a manifesto has this kind of polemical quality, and therefore there's all sorts of things that we can take from a manifesto. And of course the writer is never entirely responsible for how we interpret, how we look at things. But this is the beginning of a conversation, and thank you for your answer.
Yeah, and I'd add to what you just said that they're also not usually very well written, frankly.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivier. Our next question comes from Hal. I will read it on their behalf, and the question is this: do you think that a restoration has the same moral right to prosecute that which is replaced, or is it complicit in its own existence? Maybe Will, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I would have loved to have Pac here to help answer. I'm scrolling up to see if I can find the question again.
Oh, sure. I can also copy and paste it back into the chat.
Yeah, I think that restoration is... I don't know. I mean, I get a little nervous whenever we start talking about moral rights. So I don't know if I have the right intellectual framework to answer this question. Do you think that it has this? If you're able to speak at all, do you think you could say a little bit more about what prompted this question and what, because I know this question came pretty early in our conversation, I think when we were talking about Robespierre.
So Hal, I just asked you to unmute, but I believe Hal isn't able to be present on Zoom. But if Kaitlyn or Sarah or even Charlie, if you have anything you want to add.
I would add that I don't know either. I don't know either. To come right down to it and come right out with it, I am perplexed and baffled by a lot of the things that have come to pass. Looking for examples and alternate courses in history provides blueprints for opportunities that weren't made available in the most recent restoration.
I think what Robespierre is saying, I think, is no. I mean that the restoration itself is a kind of tacit approval of the system that the French Revolution was trying to take down. So by even undergoing a trial, that is itself a kind of acknowledgement of or a rejection of the critique that the system that allows for a trial is problematic or needs to be taken down. So I don't know if that fully translates to Joe Biden. In fact, this is something that I think in Pac's essay, the parallel he draws isn't a clean one. The French revolutionaries have some in common with the people who stormed the Capitol, but not a whole lot. So, again, this is kind of why I get a little nervous when it's phrased as a moral right, because I don't think it's necessarily that clear, but I think probably at least for Robespierre, the answer is no, but draw your own conclusion about 2021, I guess.
I have an intellectual loop-de-loop I'm doing that takes us away from that question, but I wonder if it goes back to Olivier's question, which is, can a manifesto claim, I don't think it's the same as political restoration or what happened at the Capitol, so I'm just kind of veering off, but I think it is an interesting point about the complicity of being part of a system. So if you write a manifesto, you can't just start from a blank slate. You have to acknowledge the place in which that manifesto is being written. And I think that's why someone like Euclid isn't writing one of those maybe early 20th century manifestos and is basically writing a realist, it's some kind of realism rather than utopianism, because like I say, I don't think she actually wants us to necessarily just live in maintenance, but she wants us to see that it exists. So I kind of want to go back maybe to your question and Olivier, and say that, is there a way in which a manifesto can acknowledge, Euclid said in an interview that she wrote her manifesto out of desperation, and that maybe that's how a lot of manifestos are written, because something is not working and that needs to be changed, and there needs to be a boundary so that we can look back on that boundary and hold ourselves accountable to it. But I think maybe in the utopian manifestos, there's not enough acknowledgement that you are still part of the world. Maybe Christopher, I don't know if I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe the idea that, some more egalitarian or accessible form of luxury or of quality of life, it ends up getting subsumed into like into big companies like IKEA, who make things with poor labor practices or something. You know, I think you can't just announce a utopia and then it like becomes true and you're no longer in the world. Sorry for the loop-de-loop, Hal.
No, I love the loop-de-loop, Sarah. I thought that was good to have. And I think what's interesting about Gropius when he's writing this manifesto is that he's saying like, building is going to be the complete work of art, you know, right now in salons and everything. You know, the hierarchies of art history have just been existing for way too long, and they've caused everything to grow a little like enfeebled. And it's time to sort of just like, you know, do away with that completely. And to your point, Olivier, it is sort of like it's a violent thing often. You know, you're saying if you want to wipe a slate completely clean, A, it's impossible, and B, it's also extremely violent no matter how exuberant or exciting the proposed vision is. You are always going to have to do some kind of messy erasure. What's kind of interesting about Gropius, though, is that it does have that kind of energy to it, and there are definitely moments in it where you see this kind of over-excitement and hasty desire to sort of lay everything bare. But you also have an interesting equation he's making between kind of like, you know, the arts and hierarchies in art history and hierarchies in the world as he sees it. And part of this, you know, the way this plays out is this sort of, he really values materials that might not ordinarily be associated with the domestic and recasts them in the domestic. And so taking like tubular steel or taking, you know, a certain kind of siding that would be used in an industrial context, for example, and moving it to a new place. That to me is really interesting because it's proposing a sort of new orientation to the world in which you take things that might have been undervalued or deemed sort of, you know, just totally peripheral, and you integrate them into sort of like, you know, your inner sanctum, your home. And so what I like about his manifesto, flawed as it is in many ways, is that it's not calling for a total break. It's set up with a way of thinking about things and wants to sort of like, you know, level some of that and carry the best of it forward. I think that's sort of answered.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Kaitlyn, do you want to add anything?
Oh yeah, I was trying to be like, I'm gonna loop Christopher's comment into the comments going on in the thread, but I think I just have to like address that. Sorry, that was great, Christopher. But you know, I was thinking about you know, in the thing, I'm trying to think of Sakula in terms of utopia and how manifestos contend with utopias. And I mean, the sort of impetus for Sakula to make these images and a short text that he writes to accompany them is he talks about his disinterest in the photos that the media were publishing about the protests, how they were grandiose, they were biased and skewed in a way that was very unproductive. We know these images well. There are images of, you know, like looting that takes place in this like grand scale. They're, you know, kind of mainstream media, almost cinematic, almost staged photos, or seemingly staged. So his, if you could call it a utopia of the news or utopia of the media, was to be, I guess, a little less aesthetic in the images, less like even, I almost want to say less illustrative of the totality of the event and more about the participation.
Less about, you know, spectacle, right?
Yeah, it's like anti-spectacle in that way. And you know, his so I mean, it's kind of odd to think of a utopia of mediatized images, but I think that was something that he was after. And then to that end, I mean, what we're kind of, what Sarah and Will were mentioning in the chat is this address, right? Like a utopia for whom? And yeah, I mean, that's the question, right? Like, I guess for us, sure, but like, how then does that point towards the world?
Yeah, I think that's a question that arguably you could really just apply to any manifesto. That's the framework that as you're writing the book of manifestos, you just make sure is answered in each essay. Utopia for whom and how.
Well, there's the title of your book.
Thank you so much. Our next question comes from Rail friend, regular New Social Environment attendee and poet, G.E. Schultz. I'll pass you the mic now.
Thank you so much. Really energized by the entire afternoon. I can't get over thinking how much sometimes the fall of many of the manifestos seem to be in the imprecision of language, which you mentioned, I think earlier, bad writing, bad communication in the terms of their craft, and so longer. Maybe that's why they often will come off in a very stilted way as preaching to the choir or this kind of thing. I was wondering then more about the evolution of manifestos, maybe as a kind of hybrid form, and what there might be that I don't know of that might get more traction if they were crafted as, say, performance pieces, or perhaps conceived more as a kind of campaign mission statements that then follow through as a checklist in that manner. You know, made perhaps not as straight text manifestos, but perhaps as crafted as poetry, or crafted, you know, maybe as even a fictional form of something. Just wondering if there's something like that, or if that engages here at all. Thank you.
As an aside, it's worth mentioning that in England and probably in other countries as well, political parties refer to their platforms as manifestos, and they'll publish them as such. So, you know, the Labour Party will put out a manifesto every election, which is, you know, just a bullet point list of a platform they'd like to accomplish. I mean, I think you know, we talked about this a little bit when discussing Sakula and just the question of whether or not you can call that a manifesto. And I think it does. Yeah. Part of it is what Kaitlyn just said in the chat, Ingeborg Bachmann's quote, "No new world without new language." You know, arguably you could say the same with no new world without new images, no new world without, you know, fill in the blank. I think that's certainly how I would define them. I would like to see them not just in writing. I would like to see other kinds of manifestos. I know actually at one point in the section in its earliest days, Pac was looking at doing a Jean-Luc Godard film. I forget exactly which one, Tout va bien maybe. And you know, as he discussed in the beginning, he moved away from that in order to kind of more directly address the political circumstances. You know, but I also kind of recognize that there's something that language is able to do that other media aren't, and that's kind of what compels people who normally identify themselves as writers or as as artists or as painters or as sculptors to sit down and write and actually articulate something that has a little bit more of a firmness than something like a work of art. You know, again, not trying to be too categorical and say that like works of art can't have that quality as well, but it's a strength of language, and that is ultimately what language does too. It tries to give a communal shape to something really quite private and individual as a thought. So I suspect they'll probably always kind of gravitate towards writing just for that reason, but there's certainly no reason why that has to be its only shape.
Thank you.
Does anyone else want to jump in?
I just have a little thing, which is about Euclid's, which is that her language. I think it's funny because Noah called her manifesto out as like the only well-written one, but it's really written for herself. Like, she's not making any grand claims for like what we all must do or what you all must do, and so her audience is really herself. And it's an exhibition proposal, so maybe it's a curator also, but it's like, a statement. It's almost like diaristic. And it's also interesting because I heard her interviewed about it, and she classifies the manifesto as an artwork. And so she's really clear on that, which is interesting to me too. I don't think that's an answer to your question, or a new possibility, but it's interesting to think of it instead of as like ancillary to the art or proposing a kind of art, but that it's actually a work of art itself. It's interesting.
Thanks, Sarah. Kaitlyn and Chris, do you want to say anything? Or?
Say something very quickly, which is something I sort of touched on earlier, and I wish this had made it into the piece, but that really is sort of objects as conveyors of manifestos. The way you deal with or interact with a household object, does actually kind of come with a set of ideas and assumptions. And I think when we start to break those down a little bit, something like a teapot or something really can become, and this seems like a huge stretch, but can become a kind of manifesto in that it actually actively changes the way that you interact with the physical world.
Thanks. Our next question, if you will, comes from Brian, who was digging through his own manifesto collection. Brian, I'll pass you the mic now.
Hi, hello, back again. It's been a while since I've joined you over the pond. This is the book I mentioned in the comments, Why Are We Artists? And the one that really stands out for me is a manifesto that was a collaboration between Tanya Bruguera and the Immigrant Movement International. It was actually first delivered on the 2nd of December 2011 in New York, so it's coming home. It kind of reminds me of, well, Bruguera's work is socially engaged, which would be very similar to Sakula, which you've mentioned before. So I was just going to maybe read a few wee excerpts from it and maybe get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Cool. We have been called many names: illegals, aliens, guest workers, border crossers, undesirables, exiles, criminals, non-citizens, terrorists, thieves, foreigners, invaders, undocumented. Our voices converge on these principles. We know that international connectivity is the reality that migrants have helped create. It is a place where we all reside. We understand that the quality of life of a person in a country is contingent on migrants' work. We identify as part of the engine of change. We are all tied to more than one country. The multilaterally shaped phenomenon of migration cannot be solved unilaterally, or else it generates a vulnerable reality for migrants. Implementing universal rights is essential. The right to be included belongs to everyone. We have the right to move and the right not to be forced to move. We demand the same privileges as corporations and the international elite, as they have the freedom to travel and to establish themselves wherever they choose. We are all worthy of opportunity and the change to progress. We all have the right to a better life. We believe that the only law deserving of our respect is an unprejudiced law, one that protects everyone, everywhere. No exclusions, no exceptions. We condemn the criminalization of migrant lives. So that's just a wee excerpt from it.
Thank you so much, Brian.
That was beautiful. That was very, yeah. That made me think of something that Sakula talks about, and actually the text that he writes to qualify the images, that I think Will and I in our edits, we were looking at the text kind of primarily as the manifesto to kind of work through my discussion of the images proper. But he brings up the point that, you know, it takes individuals, it takes bodies to show up in the street. It takes the individual on one side of a dock and to the other side to shut down global trade. And it's not the corporation, right? Like, it's the individuals that enact this change. And, you know, not to minimize your specific discussion of the migrant condition, which is, you know, we didn't even get a chance to touch on in this, or I don't know if the manifestos that we are talking about today really deal with that. But it is, I think, at the core interesting to think about these manifestos as coming from the sense of an individual urge. It's coming from the individual to change corporations, to change politics. You know, that's where the manifestos really come from, seemingly.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a response to that excerpt other than that it sounds lovely, and I'll read this. Other than just to say that, you know, one contributor wrote about the Anthropophagist Manifesto, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce in Portuguese, but actually last month's issue of the Rail, February issue, was dedicated to the entire idea, which is this very there's a Brazilian kind of post-colonial movement of using the idea of like cultural cannibalism, of devouring European society in order to fashion something that's truly, you know, uniquely Brazilian. So it's both indigenous and European. So it's this kind of coming together. It's this two, you know, this idea of like two cultures or several cultures that Bruguera seems to touch on, though I'm hesitant to say anything more than that without reading the full piece that she wrote. And what's interesting about Jose's piece is that he also talks about it in relation to walking. I mean, just knowing a little bit about how he discovered the piece. He discovered it one day, just kind of wandering around Buenos Aires, looking into bookshops and things like that. So there's a sense of migrancy in there as well, of a kind of cultural consumption that goes beyond borders, and what that opens up and what that allows us to do. And also what its limitations are, because the Cannibalist Manifesto, even as it proposes something uniquely Brazilian, its structure was adopted from Rimbaud's Season in Hell. So it is a very explicit adaptation of European modernism, which has its own kind of baggage about the break with history that Olivier's question kind of got at a little bit too. So I don't know, just pointing out more interesting threads, and we'll certainly read that text, because I know the broad strokes of her work, but I'm certainly not an expert on it.
Sarah or Christopher, do you want to jump in, or?
I just was noticing the use of we as opposed to what I was saying about Euclides, and I think just starting from a place of collectivity that way is really powerful and makes for a different manifesto. I mean, I think that is the limitation I see in Euclides' work, is that she ends up standing in for all the maintenance workers or all the mothers, and it's really not, as like a blonde white woman, she actually doesn't look like it. Like I used Jean Dielman, the film by Chantal Akerman, as an example of this kind of attempt to have this kind of glamorous white woman make visible some kind of labor, because you're like looking at her doing it, and it's unusual to see her doing it. And I think that there's something that isn't realist about that, and there's something that isn't collective about that. And so I just appreciate the Bruguera piece for starting from a place of already understanding a kind of collective change that can happen.
Thank you so much. Our final question and remarks comes from our very own publisher, Phong. Phong, I'm passing you a mic now, if you're ready.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kaitlyn, and Christopher, and Pac is not here. Also Brian for that remark. Yeah, I think that what Olivier was referring to is really tied to the concept of freedom. When Isaiah Berlin wrote 4 Essays of Liberty, he was arguing nor either of pro or against the notion of being free from and the notion of being free to. So there's an opposite of the two together, but the notion of utopia is not a portrait of the real world of the actual political social order. It exists at no moment of time really, or at no point in space. It is nowhere, you know? And I think in a way manifesto tend to occur, as Will pointed out, and I'm glad there was against the idea as well. It is for it being born mostly through the pressure of oppression, politically or socially. But it's interesting because one way or another, it reveals so much of the desire to write. As the testament of what you believe, it's less important than it is the desire to share, to be sure that your voice is heard. Is whether it's you know, you can argue that Vincent van Gogh was not that insured so much on the endurance of his work, because he had very little audience, except for the few people, Gauguin and occasionally some friends of Theo, maybe Omer Benoit and others. But so the writing in the 3 volumes of letters is a testament of that desire to be understood, to share, you know, with the, I think Anthropophagist was right when he say, one would never understand a deep novel unless one have lived through at least one of his chapters. And I think that Maya Angelou says similarly. She said there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. So I think one way or another, I think the idea of to live through it wholeheartedly and to have the desire to write something concretely, whether pro or for the idea of freedom to or from, utopia or not utopia, it's the ethical word is never given. It's forever in the making. And I just thought of it because when we hosted event, Yvonne Rainer here a month and a half ago, we talked briefly about her famous 1965 No Manifesto. You guys remember? It was 65, and that's way back. That is the same year that Barbara Rose wrote her famous ABC Art. That's way before minimalism and before structuralist cinema ever taken place, you know. It began no to spectacle, no to virtuosity, remember? And it ended with no to moving or being moved. But at the same time, you remember Richard Serra was very highly influenced by that when he wrote The Verbalist in 67 or 68, where it began with to roll, to crease, to fold, to bend. So there is something between the personal manifesto or revealing what you are doing in terms of restraint. So that's freedom from. But in terms of a greater group of a manifesto, what Bill's doing is to aspire to be free, to becoming free too. You know, so I think in a way, I always impress with Jonas Maker's anti-100-year manifesto. You guys remember? We actually published in the Rail, and I let me see if I can find it quickly and I read to you guys, because we published in 2004, but it was written in 96, I think. Here he say, in the time of bigness, spectaculars, 100 million movie production, I want to speak for the small, invisible acts of human spirit. No subtle, so small that they die when brought out under the clean lights. I want to celebrate the small forms of cinema, the lyrical forms, the poems, the watercolor, etude, sketch, postcard, arabesque, triolettes, the bagatelle, the little 6mm song in the times when everyone wants to succeed and sell. I want to celebrate those who embrace social and daily failure to pursue the invisible, the personal, things that bring no money and no bread and make no contemporary history, art history, or any other history. I am for art, which we do for each other as friends, for ourselves. That's the key, you guys. We do it for ourselves, friends, and hopefully others will join in and understand why we need to mobilize the community to mediate between the freedom from and to becoming free too. So thank you for coming on, sharing this luminous guest critic page, you guys. Can't wait to put it on YouTube so we have a different life. So thank you again. I need to go to another meeting and whatnot, so I will miss the luminous reading. Helixx, so forgive me, I'm leaving right now, but please stay and celebrate this occasion together. Thank you. Ciao, you guys.
Thanks, Phong. Sarah, Will, Kaitlyn, Christopher, do you want to reflect? Or shall we move to poetry?
I actually just want to say one final thing, which is that one thing we haven't really talked about today is Julia Schaefer's design of this section. So I just kind of end with a plug to please pick up a print copy if you can, because her design really kind of takes this naive and ebullient spirit and gives it a new form. And Sarah's flipping through a page to maybe hold it up, but it's a really great design. So please find a copy.
I want a second finding. Yeah, second that to finding a copy of the Rail. I think now is a great time to move to our tradition of ending our lunch with a poem. We always end all of our community events with a poetry reading. And today we're very lucky to have Helixx C Armageddon. First, I'll tell you a little bit about her. Helixx is a storyteller intrigued with the human condition. She is a performance artist that weaves together poetry, music, and fashion to shift her audiences from observers to participants. Known for her impassioned performances, Helixx channels a space for community, connection, and dialogue. For her, words are powerful and create more than narrative. Words create action and momentum towards a more just world. It's very appropriate for today. Helixx, the stage is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Can you see me okay? Because actually, awesome. So, as mentioned, my name is Helixx C Armageddon, and the piece that I'm going to do for you all today is called Railroad. I've been working on a I've been working on a railroad, 'cause I've been working on a I've been working on a railroad, 'cause I've been working on a I've been working on a railroad. Sojourner truth in decibels. I let the pull of life tow me out to the vestibule. I'm at the door of my own house. Ran my fingertips across my lips to touch doubt. I taste blood. See the foyer clearly. I see myself really. Reflecting off the mirror's quiet rooms are kinda eerie. Shadows fanning like avalanches. I feel the weight of past circumstances. I'm necromancing, it's not romantic. I'm on a canvas with the past and the future. Hands brace the floor, show my striations and sutures. Naked in my nudeness. Vacant and secluded. Scan limbs, breathe in, deconstruct the rubrics. I'm in a pool of red ink, laying in my hubris, but only just enough to shift inertia to some movement. Stopping the entombment. Core muscles moving. Spine arches forward, feel the pain and all the bruising. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a railroad. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a railroad. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a railroad. I know why the cage bird sings, even when its ravaged soul is in the middle of its own Arab Spring. Tattered rings of pseudo growth on tree stumps of hope. I'm soaked in the sweat of my years, the sweat of my ghosts from pillar to post in this mind gym. Shibari rope wrapped around my throat from the tears formed in silence. I shift my shoulder blades, I'm feeling a roving rage. Bones stack, contract like Jenga blocks before they cave. I'm sitting in an open grave. It's subtle. Crack my neck to feel the prisons in my muscles. I escape from Alcatraz. I won't escape the challenger. The blast waves demolished all my parts. I'm now a salvager. Fix my posture. Postulate the meaning. It's raining stardust. I've arrived and yet I'm leaving. Skin glistens. Wounds on my wrist. I've got a gun on my tongue and a blade in my kiss. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a railroad. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a railroad. 'Cause I've been working on I've been working on I've been working on a L road for life, for life, for life, for life, for life. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Helixx. I feel like we all needed a moment to like come down. That was a beautiful offering. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Sarah, Kaitlyn, and Charlie, and Pac, who had to leave early. This recording will be up on our YouTube later. And thank you everyone who tuned in today and for your questions and comments throughout the conversation in the chat. The Rail is celebrating our 20th anniversary as a nonprofit dedicated to providing free and accessible criticism and community events just like these. So if you enjoyed today's event, please consider making a donation to help keep the Rail free, independent, and relevant. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with the artists and members of the collective Super Duchess, Riley Davidson, Lauren Federang, and Andrew Woolbright, and they will be joined by Rail editor-at-large Jason Rosenfeld, and we'll conclude with a poetry reading from Eris White. And I'll put links to that in the chat, but for now, you should all be able to unmute yourselves and say goodbye as you leave if you like. But thank you again, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Helixx. That was
Thank you.
amazing performance.
Yeah, Helixx, thank you.
Incredible end.
Thank you, everyone.
Helixx. Great, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day and a delicious lunch. Yeah, shout out to Charlie for leading this. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, gang.